I'll just jump into the talk here. Okay, so Meteor UI. This is work I've been working on an ongoing basis for the last few months. I'm going to show you, mostly this is going to be a demo talk today where I show you some, play around with some of the new things you can do in this branch I'm working on. I'll briefly give kind of an overview of, what are the big ideas happening on this branch, what's coming next for Meteor UI. Among the goals of the Meteor UI project are these. Fine-grained reactivity, less re-rendering. Right now, you often have the experience where some handlebars helper acts as a session variable or acts as the database, and then that causes a big chunk of the page to be re-rendered. Especially if, say at the top of the page, you've got some class on your, big top-level div. Every time that class changes, your whole div is re-rendered. So part of the goal here is, have more like pinpoint reactivity. If you say an attribute should depend on something, then when that thing changes, the attribute changes. An explicit view hierarchy, that means you can basically, you have these component objects that refer to different parts of the screen, to different parts of your page. And you get a tree of those with parent and children pointers, kind of like you have in the DOM. So whereas before, you would describe your app in terms of templates, and then those templates would be kind of like magically rendered and stuff would happen. You couldn't go in the console and look at those. You couldn't manually have one component look at its children and manipulate them and do stuff like that. So that's part of the goal here. Local reactive state basically means kind of like session variables where you do session.get, session.set, but scoped to a particular template or a particular instance of a template. And I think everybody knows that's something that you need in a real app, or that comes in handy. There's tricks like you programmatically calculate your session variable name that a lot of us use. Reusable widgets. The idea there is that someone makes a widget like a slider or a drop down or a search box that has suggestions that come up in a drop down. And then there's this. Ideally, you'd have a really good modularity aspect to that, or other people can use it. It can be a smart package that requires that it be able to be configured and extended and everything like that. So that's actually a pretty strong demand on any sort of widget or component library. Animated structural operations means, you want to be able to do things like have an animated list where you do an each over database cursor, and we all want to see things flying around the screen in response to database queries changing and stuff like that. Or just in a real app, apps these days have a lot of animation. Often if you show or hide a panel, you want to animate that. You want it to slide or fade or something like that. So just doing an if doesn't really give you that power. If what the if boils down to is like either include this in the DOM or don't. So if the if changes, if the condition on the if changes from true to false, then remove it from the DOM. What you actually might want to do is like fade it out and fade it back in. Server-side compatible. This is one of the things that kind of distinguishes Meteor UI, I think, among a lot of like component frameworks or widget frameworks, which might say just kind of take jQuery and build a lot of stuff on top of it that all runs on the client. It basically means that as we design the system, we always keep this path that leads to HTML so that you can at least do some initial rendering on the server and get kind of like, the Chrome of your page or the structure of your page, or maybe the first screen sent down with the page request from the server. jQuery compatible. This is kind of a new kind of goal that's been added to Meteor UI as we realize that a lot of people use jQuery, love jQuery. There's a lot of really good things about the implementation. And if there's anything we can do to just kind of interoperate so that if you want to drop in a jQuery plugin or make some jQuery calls to do some DOM manipulation on top of your components, we can play nice with that. We can clean up the event handlers when we take stuff off the screen. We can make it easier to run a selector over the contents of a component and stuff like that. Just quickly, this is kind of a conceptual picture of a component. A component owns some part of the DOM. It doesn't have to have one top-level DOM element, which is true in a lot of frameworks. In a lot of frameworks, you take some particular div or UL and say, I'm going to put a controller on this element, or I'm going to say this element is now a component. In Meteor, we're trying to maintain the idea that, think of components as basically like templates, and they can have any set of top-level nodes you want. It could be like 3 table rows or a list item or a bunch of list items. So in this diagram, this component consists of some component which might have its own top-level DOM nodes, and then a div containing 2 components, and then a UL containing 3 LIs. So the 3 boxes labeled component in the picture would be the children of this component, and the component is supposed to treat those as kind of black boxes. But the component has the ability to move those around if it wants, as long as it kind of respects their cohesiveness as components. And then I've drawn these blue ovals off on the side to represent the fact that there's a bunch of stuff associated with an instance of a component in the DOM. You've got event maps, you've got reactive fields, you've got logic that could be observing a database cursor and then moving stuff around, which is kind of what an each does, or listening to session variables, or who knows what. These are some of the things about a component that are different from a template instance or a Spark live range or whatever we have today. Components can manipulate their DOM at will. Just programmatically, they can say, every second go in and reorder my subcomponents for fun. They can act as a block helper, which is powerful because right now you can invoke a template and maybe give it a data context, but it's kind of nifty that with if and each, you can pass in a whole block of stuff, and then that block might be invoked 1 or 0 times or n times. And components have that capability too. They can have subparts. They can be subclassed and configured. So you might have a display that's like a table component, but you want to customize how the rows look, how the cells look. You might want to just set properties, like is this a horizontal slider or vertical slider, kind of traditional GUI stuff. And it's template language agnostic. So I'm going to go into a demo here. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. These colors aren't what I was expecting, but can everybody see that? It's okay? Okay. This is just kind of my starting point app. It's pretty much what you're used to, except you might notice the way we put a helper on template.main is a little new or unusual. This is the syntax where, some of the details of the syntax here are subject to change. They're just kind of things we're trying out to see how they feel. And a lot of those things end up being some of the interesting design questions about what do people have to type to use Meteor. In this case, the idea is that you pass template.main, this big dictionary of properties. It's kind of a do what you mean thing. Most of the things become helpers, but you can also define events and other things in this dictionary. So I'm going to start by just wrapping this in a div with class red to demonstrate to you that I created this in the CSS file, this class called red earlier that makes it red. Okay, so suppose I want to not just have this necessarily be red, but be something I define in a helper, like my class. And what my class will do is it will return session.getMyClass. And if I want to toggle this, what I can do is I can put an event right here. I'll actually call this my div. And if I say click on my div, and here I'll set session my class to get my class. If it's red, then turn it to nothing. If it's nothing, turn it to red. And now, when my app refreshes, okay, then I have an app where I can click on this div, and it's flipping back and forth. So that's not very new. But what is interesting is that if I pull up the elements panel here, so here's my div. You can see it's red. When I click on it, it's changing the class. And what's new is it's actually doing that in place. It's not re-rendering the rest of the template. And I can prove that to you by putting an iframe in here. And putting an iframe with Apple's website always spruces up any web page. So there we go. And voila, I am toggling the class on this div, and the iframe is not reloading. You don't need preserve. There is no more preserve directive because nobody could figure out how to use it. So the new way of the world here is it's a big departure from before. Before, basically, we would determine kind of at a course level which templates needed re-rendering and then rerun those templates. Now what happens is the template parser actually tokenizes the HTML. It knows that this helper is occurring inside an attribute value. And what it does is it compiles it basically into an auto run, if you know about deps under the hood, that just kind of keeps an eye on that element. And when the session variable changes, it just goes in and changes that attribute. But wait, there's more. Just to be really crazy, what if we wanted to put in some arbitrary attributes, and we wanted those to be reactive, also in place? So here I'm going to just say turn session dot get attrs. And just because this this syntax is special, where you have this like triple stash tag inside a tag value, you can actually return an object from that. And what the template parser will do is it will look through that object, get all the properties of it, and turn those into attributes on the node. And it will update them appropriately if they change. So let me make some room here. Ignore the red warning that's about the iframe issue. The fact that there's an iframe on the page. OK, let's set attrs to foo::bar. Did we get it? Yeah, so basically I've got this iframe. I can click. I'm changing the class value. The iframe is not reloading. I can also change the attributes to whatever. And I could update this every second, and it would just update directly into the DOM and not change any of the surrounding DOM nodes. OK, that's nice. But I don't want to store this state in session. That's global. What I really want is every time someone makes one of these cool boxes you can click on and it turns red or not red, you can declare that state. So the syntax we have for that at the moment is I can say fields, my class, let's make it red by default. And then I don't need a helper. That just works automatically. And instead of session, I'm going to get access here to the current component. And then I'm going to say comp.set and comp.get. Oh, thank you. Let's kill this attrs thing, because that's kind of not very useful here. All right, so it's still, I'm clicking, it's turning red. It's not red. My code is even shorter because I've declared a field. And the nice thing about fields is that they're local to the instance of the component. So if I had a bunch of these red clicky boxes, they'd each have their own state. And in fact, I can demonstrate that while also demonstrating another new feature of templates, which is that you can invoke templates as block helpers. If I wanted to define a new block helper that, say, just rendered its content exactly twice. It's not an each, it's not an if, it's like, do this twice. Before I'd have to register a handlebars block helper, write some code that, took some HTML strings and concatenated them. Now I can write a template that just says insert my content twice, where what content is it's kind of a local template or local template parameter that gets set when you invoke this. So twice main. So now I've got two of these, and they each have their own state, which would definitely not be the case if I was just putting this in some session variable called, my class or something. OK, that's nice, but I don't really want to do this twice. What I'm really looking for out of my component framework is a way to abstract this red clicky box behavior. So the way I'm going to do that is, OK, I'll have some sort of main template. But right now, I want to define clicky box. And what clicky box is going to do is it's going to have this div, and then it's just going to put its content in that div. And then in main, what this allows me to do is say, you know what? I want to have one clicky box that has hello world in the greeting. And then I want to put this iframe in a different clicky box. You can say I took time to come up with really realistic use cases here. So then over here on the helper side, basically I just have to split this. So I still want my greeting to be in main, but now it's clicky box that gets the field and it gets the event handler. So if all goes well, I now have two clicky boxes by wrapping different parts of the DOM in this same helper, and still the iframe is not reloading when I click. OK, jQuery support. The thing about jQuery right now is jQuery makes it really easy to, say, like toggle a class on an element. But if a plugin comes along or some code you wrote toggles a class on an element, Meteors also might be reactively generating that class, and they'll compete. So if I say the class is the foo helper, and then jQuery goes and adds some class to it, and then we render it, we say, no, it's the result of the foo helper, like period. That's no longer true, as I'll show you. So first I will show off this other CSS rule I've defined in advance, which is called green. And what it does is it just puts kind of a thin green border around the boxes. OK, but let's add that programmatically using jQuery. So in my clicky box, let's write a rendered callback. And from this rendered callback, I'll store, from a rendered callback, this is the current component. So I'll store that in self so I have a reference to it. OK, here's something new. Self.dollar from a template rendered callback. I can say find my div. And then since this will just use jQuery if you have jQuery available, I've got this happening, it looks like on mouse up. So let's make this happen on mouse down. And on mouse down, let's say self.dollar my div dot toggle class green. Let's see if that works. So now on mouse down, it toggles the green. And once the click handler resolves on mouse up, it toggles the red. And if you look at the elements tree, you can see that the jQuery like programmatically added class and the Meteor reactively updated class are just both like cooperating. And the way that's implemented is that since Meteor now knows that a certain helper is occurring inside an attribute, it lets you extend the behavior for different attributes. So for a class attribute, there's this scripted behavior basically that says, no, like classes are a bunch of like words separated by spaces. Take the old ones, take the new ones, take the current ones, and kind of do this merge to make sure you don't lose any, excuse me, you don't lose any externally added classes. OK, so I don't have a lot of time, but I want to show you one more thing, which is, so I prepared this component in advance called a checkbox. It's like those cooking shows, and here's one I made earlier. So let's call this checkbox foo, just so you know, don't think there's any significance to the name. And the idea is that this is how UI components in general would work. Not necessarily with foo in quotes, but something like, you know, I want to use this widget to edit this value. And then on main, I will, among my fields, say there's foo, initially false. So I got this checkbox up here. It's pretty small, you probably can't see it very well. But I can prove it's working because I can, after putting this checkbox that sets foo, I can just show foo next to it. And now we've basically got two-way binding going on here. And in fact, if I want to use this value in an if, that's no problem. OK, I'm paring down the clicky boxes. We're going to have one that says hello, and we're going to have one that says world. And I'm going to say arbitrarily, if foo, then hello, else world. There we go. Oops. OK. OK, now I'm toggling between hello and world on this checkbox. And since I said you would eventually be able to do structural animations, I whipped one up here. What if instead of an if, this is actually a fadey if? And this worked this morning. And if I press it really fast, I even get like multiple elements. And then, since I said there was some OO going on in here, let's define my fadey if equals fadey if dot extend with an animation duration of 100. And now let's use my fadey if. Let's go with the snappier animation. So that's all I got. Any questions? Yes? How does the fadey if work? It's using jQuery animation. So part of it is just calling out to jQuery. And part of it is it uses this API that's meant for manipulating the child components of your component. So basically, you need a way to be able to say, I've been given this like block that generates a hello h1, but I don't know that. And this other block that's like the else content. And I should be able to instantiate those and add them to the template, but dynamically. So like this actually, like the way it fades out is it starts the jQuery animation. And then when the animation finishes using the jQuery complete callback, it finds that child component and it like removes it. It's
The question was, is the code fit for human consumption yet?
Oh yes, David Glasser's question. It's not as clean as I would like it to be, but I can definitely show it. Yeah, so fadey if, it does this thing to, let's see. So I mean, it uses some features that wouldn't be obvious from my demo that are actually kind of nice. Like you can do an auto run from this call that's called render, which is basically like where you're supposed to do your main rendering. It generates HTML on the server, generates DOM on the client automatically. And yeah, this is the part that like is messier than it should be. But that's the entire code. And mainly what it's doing is just kind of the bookkeeping of, keeping track of the child components, manipulating the DOM in appropriate ways. And what else can I say about this? Yeah, the idea is like, this should be smaller too. Like this sort of like level of the API is definitely, there's these different tiers, right? Because like someone's first, 90 seconds of Meteor, which we talk about a lot, is, you're using components maybe, you're defining templates, you're defining helpers. At some point you want to start creating components. At some point then you want to, create animated components. Ideally there'd be some sort of, pre-selection of nice animated widgets that are configurable and stuff. But ultimately, even this kind of low-level API would like to be nice because it just kind of increases the power of the whole framework if you have these kind of nice primitives to play with. There's certainly, this is definitely better than, in the current Meteor in terms of writing an animated widget because there's just this level of control, basically, and the fact that, it's adding all these child components and tracking them. That uses the machinery of, components can have arbitrary children. They're set up with some, child components based on their initial rendering, but then on the client, due to callbacks and, the rendered callback, timers, database changes, you can interpret those any way you like. You can write your own each callback. Sorry, you can write your own each component that listens to a database cursor and like adapts that into any sort of DOM or subcomponent manipulation, or take some reactive source that's not like a database cursor. So we want to kind of make it pluggable like that. So like I wrote each as a component, which was kind of one of these exercises like, well, you better be able to write like a reactive each. And I didn't even get to demo the fact that now each over just plain arrays will actually reuse components, and each over objects will not destroy the whole thing and re-render it like it used to. It'll do some amount of matching. And that's due to this kind of framework that's in place.
Can you explain why you use self.$sign instead of $self find?
Yeah, the question was, why do you have to type self.$, or why do you type self.$, not just $, to use jQuery? Basically, it's a way to express, I want to run a selector scoped to this component. And because components don't necessarily have a single top-level element, they might have any number of top-level elements, there's no easy way to express to jQuery, like, search this range of the DOM. Like, I want to find divs of class my div, but only if they're like in children 5 through 10 of this like container div. So it's basically, it's a convenience. Like the syntax you might imagine if jQuery supported it would be like you call $, on like the component or something, right? You extend jQuery, which already lets you call $, on myriad things like DOM elements and existing jQuery collections and HTML strings. It's kind of overloaded with all these types. Maybe you could make component one of those types. But basically, conceptually, a component is a lot like a virtual DOM element. It's a lot like some container for a bunch of DOM elements that just doesn't show up in the DOM. And every framework has to grapple with that in one way or another. And some of them say like, oh, a component will just like be an element. You always have one top-level element that's identified with the component. Or if you're maybe like Angular or in the Google camp, you say, we're going to make up this concept of like virtual DOM elements that aren't actually in the DOM, that are like phantom DOM elements. And I think that's just different ways of coming at the same concept. So we're trying to create this illusion that you have these virtual DOM elements because it's a nice way to think about it. And that's kind of what templates are in a way, if you were to take the concept of templates calling each other and materialize that at runtime. But yeah, that's kind of the syntax we have for that.
We have a question from Twitter.
Oh.
How backwards compatible is the new Meteor UI, and also any ETA for when it's going to be usable for everyone?
That's a good question. In terms of backwards compatibility, we want to keep like a lot of the functionality will be the same. We want the ease of use to be the same. Some of the syntax will be the same, but we're giving ourselves license to break, syntax, like even commonly used syntax stuff, like how you define template helpers and stuff, if it's in service of this kind of UI component world. So there will be a bunch of breaking changes, and you will have to go through your app and update it. But we're going to try to be reasonable about that. I don't have any release date for this. We're all also eager to get it out there. But it's definitely what I'm going to be working on for the coming few months, and we're going to work on just kind of rolling it down the conveyor belt, basically. Yep.
So I really like the components, and I think that that is the future, because I was looking at the Google Polymer project.
Polymer, that's yeah.
And I think it's very similar to that. You define your own tags, and they're reactive within your own scope. And I was just wondering what you thought about the Polymer project.
Yeah, I think they've got a lot of good ideas, and some of the same ideas about defining.
The question was about thoughts on the Polymer project.
The question was about the Google Polymer project, which is basically a client-side system for. It's kind of like you're defining components, but in their world, it's you're defining custom tags, basically like HTML tags that are rendered in terms of other HTML tags. I think my biggest issue with it is the implementation, which is very heavyweight, because what they're basically saying is we want this to be built into browsers. Instead of template languages, we want features that make HTML with curly braces in it suitable for consumption directly by the browser. And instead of having JavaScript have this object-oriented component library, which seems like a pretty reasonable thing to me, they want those components to be HTML tags. And then say that HTML tags now have these semantics of how they're rendered. So you could define a custom input tag that's enter your birth date, and actually that renders as 3 input tags for month, day, and year, or something like that. And it's kind of a different approach. But because they take the view that maybe this will be built into browsers one day, what they then do is they try to polyfill this to existing browsers, which turns out to be really tricky. So their browser support is no IE, because even their polyfills require features that aren't implemented in any version of IE. They support the latest version of Safari, Firefox, and Chrome, and they have this grid for kind of when they can have better compatibility with browsers. That's mostly red, not a lot of green, because they want DOM mutation events and object observe events, and it's kind of a heavyweight polyfill because they wrap every DOM node basically. The DOM nodes that your application works with are these facades generated by Polymer, so that when you go to access a DOM node, you call .parent node and it intercepts that, and it's okay, what would the parent node be in the new cool world where you've got custom elements? So I'm going to keep an eye on it, and certainly the implementation technologies. I love when browsers move forward. Now we can observe objects. Now we can define getters and setters on JavaScript objects. But I think it's really important to focus on the details of how do you implement these things. How do you make sure people can use them in all browsers and they're fast enough and stuff like that.
And one last question from Twitter. Any plans on updating example apps with reactive components?
Yes. In fact, that'll be one of the first things we do, because if to-dos doesn't look 200% better with components, then we're doing something wrong. So. Yeah, the question was, are we going to update the example apps with the new component stuff as it becomes available? And the answer is definitely yes, yeah.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.